The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of St. Mary Mead's village hall, casting delicate shadows across the pale green walls as the annual summer exhibition committee held its monthly gathering. Miss Marple sat in her customary chair, the one positioned near the window where she could observe both the committee members and the garden beyond, her knitting needles clicking with metronomic regularity. To any observer, she appeared to be merely another elderly woman attending to her handicraft, her pale blue eyes focused intently on the pale pink cardigan taking shape beneath her needles. No one would have noticed that her attention was equally divided between the Fair Isle pattern and the conversation unfolding before her, particularly the subtle tension emanating from Margaret Ashford, the committee chairwoman, whose jaw had tightened noticeably when the subject of the hall's renovation fund had arisen. Margaret sat at the head of the mahogany table, her perfectly coiffed silver hair catching the light, her fingers drumming in irregular rhythm against the polished wood. She had always been meticulous about such details, her appearance, her position, her control over village affairs. But today, there was something else present in her demeanor, something that reminded Miss Marple of a piano string wound too tightly, ready to snap at the slightest additional pressure. The village of St. Mary Mead had enjoyed a particularly harmonious summer thus far, or so it appeared on the surface. The gardens were flourishing with unusual abundance, the church flowers had never looked more magnificent, and the local Women's Institute had reported record attendance at their weekly meetings. Yet Miss Marple, who had lived in the village for more years than she cared to count, and had developed an almost preternatural ability to read the undercurrents beneath polite society's surface, detected something different this year. There was a quality to the whispered conversations that occurred when the vicar's wife turned her back, a specific tension in the way certain ladies avoided one another at the post office, and an unusual defensiveness in Margaret Ashford's responses to even the most innocuous questions. It was a pattern Miss Marple recognized from decades of observation, the pattern that preceded something significant, though whether that something would prove to be merely scandalous gossip or something more serious, she could not yet determine. The renovation fund discussion had arisen because the village hall, a Victorian structure that had served the community for over 100 years, required urgent repairs to its roof before the autumn rains arrived. Margaret, as both chairwoman of the exhibition committee and a long-time member of the parish council, had proposed a fundraising initiative that would combine 3 traditional village events into one spectacular afternoon: the summer fete, the flower show, and a small garden party tea at her own residence, Ashford House. It was an ambitious plan, and Margaret had presented it with her characteristic efficiency, her voice measured and authoritative as she outlined the schedule, the projected revenue, and the volunteer assignments. She had allocated considerable responsibility to one person in particular, Diana Hartwell, a woman in her early 50s who had moved to St. Mary Mead approximately 18 months prior and had quickly involved herself in various village committees. Diana was an attractive woman in that deliberately cultivated manner, her ash-blonde hair professionally maintained, her clothing always fashionable without being ostentatious, her manner friendly but somehow always slightly reserved, as though there was some essential part of herself she kept cordoned off from casual village acquaintance. Margaret had assigned Diana the responsibility of coordinating the tea service at her garden, a task that required considerable organizational skill and attention to detail. Diana had accepted the assignment with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and it was at precisely that moment, when Diana's smile had frozen on her face for just a fraction of a second longer than natural, that Miss Marple's knitting needles had paused almost imperceptibly in their rhythm. The pause had been subtle, certainly invisible to anyone not specifically watching for such things, but it had conveyed something important. There was a history between these two women, Miss Marple deduced, though their interaction appeared cordial enough on the surface. Perhaps something had passed between them before Diana arrived in St. Mary Mead, or perhaps the tension had developed gradually since Diana's arrival. Either way, the assignment seemed deliberately made, and Diana's acceptance seemed equally deliberate. as though they were both playing roles in some pre-arranged performance. The meeting had continued for another 40 minutes, moving through the standard agenda items: approval of the previous month's minutes, discussion of the autumn flower show dates, and a report on the condition of the village hall's kitchen equipment. Miss Marple had contributed only minimal commentary, a few gentle suggestions regarding the timing of tea service that were received graciously and incorporated into the plans. She had allowed the other committee members, Dorothy Pembroke, who fancied herself an expert on village affairs, though she rarely saw beyond the surface of any situation; Jennifer Matthews, a nervous secretary who seemed perpetually overwhelmed by her responsibilities; and Thomas Whitley, the parish council representative, who maintained a careful neutrality on most matters, to lead the discussion and make their own observations. It was only when the meeting was concluding, as the ladies gathered their handbags and began to rise from their chairs, that something unusual occurred, something that would later assume considerable significance. A knock had sounded at the village hall door, sharp and urgent, echoing through the relatively quiet room. Thomas Whitley, being the nearest, had risen to answer it, and a young man had entered, breathless and flustered, his face flushed from exertion or anxiety, or perhaps both. This was Peter Ashford, Margaret's son, a solicitor based in the neighboring town of Much Benham, whom Miss Marple had only encountered a handful of times over the years. He was a man in his early 30s, with his mother's sharp features and her tendency to command attention when he entered a room. He had approached his mother directly, bending to whisper something into her ear, something that had caused Margaret's complexion to shift from its normal healthy pink to a shade considerably more pallid. Margaret had risen from her chair with sudden abruptness, her knitting abandoned on the seat, and had announced to the assembled group that a family matter required her immediate attention. She would be in touch regarding the summer event details, she had said, her voice tighter than usual, and she and Peter had departed the hall with unseemly haste. The remaining committee members had exchanged glances that ranged from curiosity to concern to something that might have been satisfaction at the disruption to Margaret's composure. Diana, Miss Marple had observed, had remained perfectly still, her expression neutral, though her hands had trembled imperceptibly, as she placed her papers into her handbag. By the time the group dispersed into the golden afternoon light, the incident had already begun its transformation into village speculation. Dorothy had mentioned the incident to Jennifer before they parted at the gate, their voices pitched low but audible enough to establish that they found the whole affair quite mysterious. Jennifer, starved for excitement as she generally was, had promptly decided that Margaret must be receiving terrible news, perhaps regarding her health or that of her husband. Thomas Whitley had said nothing, but his expression had suggested careful calculation, as though he were mentally cataloguing information for future reference. Miss Marple had simply gathered her knitting. The pale pink cardigan was now considerably further along, and had walked home to her cottage through the quiet streets of St. Mary Mead, her mind sorting through details, filing away observations, and beginning the preliminary work of pattern recognition that decades of observation had taught her was so often illuminating. She could not have known, as she settled into her armchair that evening with a cup of tea and her knitting, that the incident at the village hall marked only the beginning, that the tensions she had sensed simmering beneath the surface of St. Mary Mead's tranquility were about to reach a boiling point, and that within the week the peaceful village would be shattered by an event far more significant than a hastily departed committee member. She could not have known that the pale pink cardigan she was knitting would remain unfinished for considerably longer than she anticipated, interrupted by a matter that would demand her full attention and draw upon every ounce of her accumulated wisdom regarding human nature, motivation, and the capacity of apparently ordinary people to commit extraordinary CTs of violence. But as she knitted, her fingers moving with practiced precision, the pale blue eyes that seemed to observe nothing in particular were actually absorbing and analyzing everything, storing away small details and significant trifles alike, waiting for the moment when the pattern would become clear. The morning after the committee meeting arrived with a kind of golden English sunlight that seemed to promise that nothing unpleasant could possibly occur in its warmth. Miss Marple had risen early, as was her custom, and had taken her breakfast in the small dining room of her cottage, gazing out at her garden where the roses were in full bloom, and the foxgloves stood like purple sentinels along the borders. She had read the Morning Post, a letter from her nephew Raymond, an invitation to the Women's Institute's summer outing, and a notice regarding the library's new acquisition of several gardening books, with the same deliberate attention she brought to all matters, missing nothing. It was while she was arranging fresh flowers in the blue Delft vase that stood on her mantelpiece that the first real news of the day arrived, delivered not through any official channel, but through the rapid-fire gossip network that operated in St. Mary Mead with the efficiency of a military operation. Mrs. Elspeth Thornton, who lived 2 cottages down the lane, and who had cultivated an almost supernatural ability to know what was occurring in the village, sometimes before it had even finished occurring, appeared at Miss Marple's garden gate with an expression of barely contained excitement. Elspeth was a woman in her 70s with iron-grey hair, bright observant eyes, and a tendency to speak at considerable length about matters both significant and trivial. She had dressed with particular care that morning, Miss Marple noted, her good blue dress rather than her everyday cotton, her pearls rather than her usual costume jewelry, suggesting that she anticipated the information she was about to share would warrant special presentation. Miss Marple invited her in for coffee, a gesture that would have been impossible to refuse without causing considerable offense, and settled herself in the parlor with the kind of patient attention that Elspeth interpreted as keen interest, but which actually represented something considerably more subtle, the systematic collection of information presented alongside its natural context and emotional coloring, according to Elspeth, and according to the chain of reports that had already begun circulating through the village's female population. Something quite extraordinary had occurred at Ashford House the previous evening. Specifically, there had been what could only be described as a family confrontation of considerable intensity. Elspeth had learned this through her neighbour, Patricia Summers, who had learned it through her cousin, who worked as a cleaner at Ashford House and who had observed several things: the sound of raised voices emanating from the study window in the late afternoon, Margaret Ashford's appearance at the dinner hour, with eyes that suggested recent tears or considerable emotional disturbance, and most tellingly, Peter Ashford departing the house in his motor car shortly after dinner with such velocity that the gravel had scattered dramatically across the driveway. Furthermore, Elspeth added with the air of one delivering particularly juicy information, Diana Hartwell's car had been observed parked outside Ashford House until quite late in the evening, suggesting either a social visit of remarkable duration or something considerably more meaningful. Miss Marple received this information with polite interest, making appropriate murmurs of concern and inquiry that encouraged Elspeth to continue elaborating on her theme. She asked whether anyone knew the nature of the family disagreement, whether Margaret had appeared ill or injured in any way, and whether anyone had actually spoken with Peter or Margaret since the incident. Elspeth, caught between her desire to appear knowledgeable and her honest admission that such direct knowledge remained elusive, was forced to acknowledge that the information was largely circumstantial and derived from observation and inference rather than actual conversation. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully at this, her fingers absently playing with the folds of her cardigan, and remarked that it was remarkable how quickly information travelled through a small village, even when that information was incomplete. She wondered aloud whether it might be unwise to construct elaborate theories based on fragmentary evidence, a comment that Elspeth received with somewhat less enthusiasm than she had anticipated. Nevertheless, Elspeth lingered for another 20 minutes, becoming increasingly concerned that her dramatic presentation of the morning's news had failed to generate the response of shocked surprise and avid interest she had expected. Miss Marple's calm acceptance of the information, her lack of speculation regarding its meaning, and her gentle suggestion that there were often innocent explanations for apparently suspicious circumstances, seemed to deflate rather than inflate Elspeth's enthusiasm. When Elspeth finally departed, promising to update Miss Marple should any additional information come to light, there was a subtle disappointment in her demeanour that suggested she had hoped for a more satisfying response to her intelligence. After Elspeth's departure, Miss Marple occupied herself with her usual morning tasks, tidying the cottage, preparing vegetables for the midday meal, and attending to her correspondence. Yet a portion of her ND remained occupied with the information she had received, turning it over, examining it from various angles, considering what might underlie such dramatic evidence of family discord. She knew Margaret Ashford's reputation as a woman of considerable control and precision. She knew that Margaret was not the sort to engage in public displays of emotion absent very significant provocation. She also knew, from the village's accumulated knowledge of local affairs, that Margaret's marriage to her husband, Richard, was one of those long-established unions that had settled into comfortable routine, the sort of partnership more characterized by polite coexistence than passionate engagement. Margaret's relationship with her son Peter had always appeared cordial but somewhat formal, lacking the warmth that often characterized bonds between mothers and adult children. The arrival of Diana Hartwell, 18 months previously, had been noted by the village with the kind of attention it reserved for newcomers, particularly newcomers of uncertain provenance and independent means. Diana had purchased Whitmore Lodge, a substantial property on the edge of the village, with apparently unlimited funds, and had begun immediately to involve herself in village life. There had been the usual speculation about her background, her marital status, or lack thereof, and her reasons for choosing St. Mary Mead as a residence. Some had suggested she was a widow. Others had speculated about artistic sensibilities or perhaps a mysterious past. She had proven to be a genuinely pleasant addition to the village, always willing to contribute to charity efforts, engaging politely if not intimately with village society, and causing no obvious offense or scandal. Yet there remained something about her that seemed to suggest depths unplumbed, layers beneath the pleasant surface that she had no intention of revere. It was in the early afternoon that the second piece of information arrived, delivered this time by Thomas Whitley, the parish council representative, who had called upon Miss Marple with the stated purpose of discussing the summer event planning. However, as they sat in her parlour with tea and biscuits, he had mentioned almost casually that he had encountered Margaret at the post office that morning, and had observed that she seemed somewhat distressed. She had been pleasant enough in her greeting, he had said, but there had been a quality to her demeanour that suggested preoccupation with matters beyond the ordinary. Thomas, being a man of careful observation himself, and possessing his own reasons for maintaining awareness of Margaret's current emotional state, had ventured to ask whether everything was well, and Margaret had replied rather sharply that everything was perfectly well, and that he need not concern himself with matters that did not pertain to him. Miss Marple received this information with a slight inclination of her head that might have indicated understanding, or might have indicated merely polite acknowledgement. She asked Thomas whether he thought Margaret's irritation was of the sort that suggested genuine distress, or merely the temporary annoyance of someone occupied with pressing matters. Thomas, perhaps gratified to discover that Miss Marple shared his own inclination toward careful analysis, admitted that he believed it to be the former rather than the latter. He went on to mention, in that careful way of someone sharing information they are not entirely certain they should be sharing, that there had been considerable tension in the parish council meetings lately regarding the allocation of certain funds for the village improvement project, and that Margaret, in her role as council member, had taken positions that had not been universally popular. He wondered aloud whether family matters might be intimately connected to such public disagreements, a suggestion that Miss Marple received with interest, though she offered no commentary on its validity. After Thomas's departure, Miss Marple settled into her afternoon routine, though her mind continued to process the information she had accumulated. She considered the possible connections between the various pieces of information, the family confrontation, Diana Hartwell's extended visit, Peter Ashford's rapid departure, the tension regarding village finances, and Margaret's apparent emotional disturbance. She considered also what she did not know, the substance of the family disagreement, the nature of Peter's relationship with Diana, the reasons for Diana's apparently prolonged presence at Ashford House, and whether there existed any actual connection between these events, or whether they represented merely coincidental occurrences happening to take place in temporal proximity. It was this last consideration that occupied her most thoroughly as she settled into her armchair with her knitting, the pale pink cardigan, had progressed considerably, and allowed her fingers to work through their familiar patterns while her mind continued its own more subtle investigations into the patterns that governed human behavior, motivation, and the circumstances that transformed apparently ordinary village life into something considerably more complex and significantly more dangerous. The week following the committee meeting and the subsequent revelations regarding the family disturbance at Ashford House progressed with that peculiar quality of suspended anticipation that sometimes characterizes small communities when something significant has occurred, but its full implications remain unclear. The village had developed a kind of collective awareness that something was amiss, Thaug. The specifics of what that something might be remained frustratingly opaque to most residents. The normal rhythms of St. Mary Mead's social life continued on the surface. The post office remained a hub of conversation, the church services proceeded with customary regularity, the Women's Institute met for their weekly gathering, yet there was an underlying current of tension. A sense that events were building towards some kind of resolution, though whether that resolution would be benign or significant remained to be determined. Miss Marple, moving through the village with her customary calm demeanor, observed this collective unease with the kind of detached interest one might bring to observing a particularly complex piece of needlework. It was on the Thursday of that week, while Miss Marple was purchasing groceries at the village shop, that she encountered Diana Hartwell. Diana appeared somewhat tired, Miss Marple thought, though she had made an obvious effort to conceal this fact through the application of makeup and the selection of a particularly flattering dress in pale lavender silk. They greeted one another with the pleasant cordiality that characterized their interactions, and Diana inquired after Miss Marple's health and her progress on various village projects. It was a conversation that, on the surface, contained nothing of particular interest, the kind of exchange that occurred regularly between village residents, yet Miss Marple detected something beneath the pleasant words and the carefully modulated tone. There was a brittleness to Diana's courtesy, a quality that suggested she was operating on willpower alone, maintaining a facade of normalcy despite considerable internal disturbance. When Diana mentioned, in what she clearly intended to be a casual manner, that she was looking forward to assisting with the summer event planning, there was a fractional hesitation before she spoke, as though she were consciously choosing her words with particular care. Miss Marple responded to this comment with apparent innocence, remarking that it must be gratifying to feel so involved in village life after having lived here for such a relatively short time. She went on to suggest, in that gentle way of hers that made even potentially intrusive observations seem merely friendly interest, that it must be pleasant for Diana to have developed friendships within the community, particularly with someone like Margaret Ashford, who was such a respected and established figure in village affairs. The effect of this comment upon Diana was subtle but observable, a slight tightening of the muscles around her eyes, a barely perceptible catch in her breathing, before she recovered herself and offered a polite agreement. She remarked that Margaret was indeed a remarkable woman, that the village was fortunate to have her guidance and leadership, and that she herself felt honored to be included in village activities. The words were correct, but something in the way they were delivered suggested they represented a performance rather than a genuine expression of feeling. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple received a visitor of considerable importance to the unfolding situation, though she could not have known his significance at the moment of his arrival. Inspector David Hartbury of the County Police had come to St. Mary Mead on what he had carefully explained to the vicar as a routine matter regarding some minor concerns about unauthorized activity in the village environs, concerns that had likely proven to be unfounded, but which required professional investigation nonetheless. The cover story was transparent enough that anyone with any understanding of village affairs would have immediately recognized it as precisely that, a cover story. Yet it served the necessary function of allowing him to move through the village without causing the kind of speculation and alarm that an official police investigation might otherwise have generated. Inspector Hartbury was a man of approximately 50 years, with grey hair, and the kind of thoughtful face that suggested he spent considerably more time listening than speaking. He had called upon Miss Marple in her capacity as a long-time resident, with extensive knowledge of village affairs, a designation that was both accurate and somewhat misleading, During their conversation in Miss Marple's parlour, conducted over tea that Miss Marple had prepared with care and biscuits that she had baked herself that very morning, the inspector had explained that he was investigating certain irregularities in the financial records of the parish council, specifically regarding the allocation and use of funds designated for village improvement projects. It was, he had emphasized, likely a matter of simple administrative confusion or innocent error, but such matters required clarification regardless. He wondered whether Miss Marple, in her capacity as someone familiar with village life and village personalities, might be willing to share any observations regarding the conduct of parish council business, the relationships between council members, or any tensions that might have arisen regarding financial matters. It was a request framed with such delicate politeness that it would have been difficult to refuse without appearing to obstruct a lawful investigation, though Miss Marple had managed a response that was simultaneously helpful and remarkably non-committal. She had confirmed that there had indeed been some discussion regarding the village improvement project, that such discussions were not unusual, and that different council members often held differing opinions regarding the best allocation of resources. She had mentioned in passing that Thomas Whitley had seemed concerned about certain aspects of the project, and that Margaret Ashford appeared to hold strong views regarding its implementation. She had also noted that Peter Ashford, being a solicitor, might occasionally be consulted regarding legal aspects of village financial matters, though she could not speak to the specifics of any such consultations. The inspector had listened to all of this with careful attention, making occasional notes in the small leather notebook he carried, and had thanked her for her assistance. He had also mentioned before departing that if any additional matters of concern should arise, he would appreciate being informed, providing her with his contact information. After the inspector's departure, Miss Marple had settled herself in her armchair and had considered the implications of his visit. The mention of financial irregularities in the parish council records suggested that there was more substance to the tensions she had observed than mere social discord or family disagreement. It suggested that something concrete had prompted official investigation, that someone had made a complaint or raised questions regarding the handling of village funds. She considered who might have had access to such financial records, who might have possessed the motivation to question them, and whose conduct might have been sufficiently irregular to warrant police attention. The list of possibilities was not extensive, and when she began to consider it in conjunction with the other information she had accumulated, the family confrontation at Ashford House, Diana Hartwell's extended visit, Peter Ashford's rapid departure, and the general atmosphere of tension that had begun to characterize relations between Margaret and others in the village, a pattern began to suggest itself, though the P.A. turn remained incomplete and certain crucial elements remained unclear. It was that evening that Miss Marple received a telephone call from Margaret Ashford, a communication that was sufficiently unusual that it commanded immediate attention. Margaret, speaking in carefully controlled tones that barely masked some underlying emotion, wondered whether Miss Marple might be available for tea the following afternoon at Ashford House. She expressed the hope that Miss Marple would accept this invitation, suggesting that she valued Miss Marple's judgment and her understanding of village life, and that there were certain matters she wished to discuss in confidence. Miss Marple, who had detected in Margaret's carefully chosen words something that suggested this was not a social invitation, but rather something considerably more significant, had accepted with a courtesy that matched Margaret's own. After replacing the telephone receiver, she had sat quietly for several minutes, considering what Margaret might wish to discuss, and why Margaret had chosen to seek Miss Marple's counsel at this particular moment. The answers to these questions would likely prove to be illuminating, and Miss Marple found herself contemplating her pale pink cardigan, which remained frustratingly incomplete, and wondering whether the upcoming week would provide her with the time or the tranquility necessary to complete it, or whether her attention would be required elsewhere, occupied by matters considerably more pressing than the completion of needlework. The afternoon of Miss Marple's appointment at Ashford House arrived with weather that seemed almost deliberately inappropriate to the gravity of the occasion. The sun shone brilliantly, the birds sang with particular enthusiasm, and the gardens throughout the village displayed their flowers with almost obscene cheerfulness, creating a stark and tulling contrast to the tension that seemed to permeate the village air. Miss Marple dressed with particular care for the visit, selecting her best afternoon dress in dove grey and pinning her hair with more attention than usual, recognizing that her appearance would communicate something significant to Margaret, who was sufficiently observant to notice such details. She arrived at Ashford House at the appointed time, neither early nor late, understanding that precision in such matters was itself a form of communication. Ashford House was a substantial Victorian residence situated on several acres of well-maintained grounds, the kind of property that announced its inhabitants' position and prosperity through its very architecture and landscaping. The house had been in Margaret's family for generations, a fact that she mentioned with a frequency that suggested she invested considerable significance in such continuity and stability. Miss Marple had visited the house on several previous occasions, for parish council gatherings, for fundraising, committees, and for the occasional social event, yet her entrance today felt somehow different, weighted with implications that extended beyond the ordinary social conventions that typically governed such visits. Margaret received her in the drawing-room, a space decorated with the kind of tasteful restraint that characterized Margaret's aesthetic sensibilities. She appeared, Miss Marple noted, considerably more composed than she had seemed in recent days, though there remained in her eyes a quality that suggested she had engaged in considerable internal struggle before arriving at whatever decision had prompted her to request this meeting. Tea was served with the customary formalities, the fine china, the carefully arranged cakes and sandwiches, the hot water for tea prepared to precise specifications. They discussed, for the first 15 minutes or so, the weather, the progress of the gardens, and various village matters of relative insignificance. It was a conversation that served the function of establishing normalcy, of allowing both participants to assess the other and to determine the appropriate level of disclosure for the conversation that would inevitably follow. Miss Marple, familiar with this particular social dance, participated with appropriate responses, while her observant eyes noted details about Margaret's demeanor. The way her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea, the slight tightness around her mouth, the quality of her smile, which suggested effort rather than genuine ease. It was only when Margaret had finished her own cup of tea and had set it aside with deliberate care that she broached the subject that had prompted this invitation. She began by thanking Miss Marple for her long years of service to the village, for her wisdom and her discretion, qualities that Margaret had come to value increasingly as she had navigated the complexities of village leadership. She then proceeded, in carefully measured language, to explain that she faced a situation of considerable delicacy, one that involved family matters, financial irregularities, and personal betrayals of a nature that she found deeply distressing. She hesitated frequently as she spoke, as though she were struggling to determine how much to reveal, and what information might be safely entrusted to someone outside her immediate family circle. What emerged from Margaret's account, presented in fragments and with considerable circumlocution, was the following narrative. Peter Ashford, her son, had become involved in a romantic relationship approximately 2 years previously. The woman in question was someone he had met while practicing law, someone who worked in a professional capacity in his firm's office. The relations. Hip had proceeded secretly, concealed from Margaret and from Peter's father, Richard, because Peter had sensed that his parents would not approve. The reasons for this disapproval, Margaret explained with evident reluctance, related to certain aspects of the woman's background and character that had caused concern. Approximately 6 months ago, this woman, whose name Margaret revealed was Diana Hartwell, had terminated the relationship with Peter, following a disagreement regarding marriage and commitment. Peter, deeply affected by this rejection, had subsequently moved to St. Mary Mead, ostensibly to establish a private legal practice, though Margaret had suspected that his true motivation involved proximity to Diana, who had, quite coincidentally or perhaps not at all coincidentally, also decided to relocate to the village at approximately the same time. This revelation had precipitated considerable conflict within the Ashford household. Peter's father, Richard, had expressed grave concerns regarding Peter's judgment and his apparent obsession with someone who had already rejected him. Margaret herself had endeavored to encourage Peter to recognize the futility of pursuing a relationship that the other party had clearly terminated, while simultaneously attempting to manage the delicate social situation of having both Peter and Diana resident within the same small community. The situation had remained relatively stable, though clearly uncomfortable, until approximately 1 week previously, when Margaret had discovered something profoundly disturbing. Evidence suggesting that Peter had been involved in financial irregularities within the parish council's accounts, irregularities that appeared designed to have the effect of enriching himself or, more disturbingly, of redirecting funds in a manner that might benefit Diana Hartwell or entities in which she held some form of interest. Margaret had confronted Peter regarding these suspicions, which had led directly to the family confrontation that had been observed by various village residents. Peter had, according to Margaret's account, alternated between denying any wrongdoing and attempting to justify his actions based on emotional motivations that Margaret found both incomprehensible and morally indefensible. He had admitted to certain financial manipulations, but had insisted that they had been undertaken not for personal profit, but rather in an attempt to secure Diana's affection by demonstrating his ability to provide for her, to offer her advantages and securities that he believed she desired. The admission had horrified Margaret, who had taken the matter to her husband, Richard, and together they had concluded that they were obligated to report the matter to the appropriate authorities, a decision that had caused Peter considerable distress and had precipitated his rapid departure from the house during the evening in question. Now, Margaret explained, she found herself facing an extraordinarily difficult situation. The police were investigating the financial irregularities, which meant that the matter would inevitably become public knowledge, bringing shame upon the Ashford family and disrupting the peaceful stability of village life. Furthermore, she harbored considerable concerns regarding Diana Hartwell, who had demonstrated, through her continued residence in the village and her involvement in various village activities, a determination to maintain proximity to Peter despite the romantic relationship's termination. Margaret wondered whether Diana's involvement in the family's life might itself represent some form of manipulation, whether Diana might be attempting to exploit Peter's emotional vulnerability for purposes that remained unclear, but which Margaret's instincts were not benign. Miss Marple listened to all of this with the kind of patient attention that she brought to all matters, asking occasional gentle questions that clarified certain details without suggesting judgment or criticism of Margaret or her family. When Margaret had concluded her narrative and was awaiting Miss Marple's response, Miss Marple was quiet for a considerable moment, her pale blue eyes gazing out the window toward the gardens beyond, her fingers folded in her lap with a kind of composure that suggested she was not merely receiving information, but was processing it with considerable depth. She then turned to face Margaret directly and asked a series of questions, each phrased with delicate precision. Had Margaret considered the possibility that Peter's motivations might be more complex than mere romantic obsession? Had she investigated the nature of Diana's financial circumstances or her background prior to her arrival in St. Mary Mead? Had she considered why someone like Diana, apparently possessing independent means and no obvious connections to the village, would choose to relocate here and would subsequently involve herself so extensively in village affairs? Margaret, somewhat startled by the direction these questions took, admitted that she had not investigated such matters thoroughly, having assumed that Peter's emotional vulnerability was the primary issue requiring attention. Miss Marple then observed, in that gentle but penetrating way of hers, that sometimes the most obvious explanation for human behavior was not the complete explanation, and that circumstances that appeared to involve simple romantic obsession might occasionally conceal considerably more complex motivations and relationships. She suggested that Margaret might find it profitable to investigate Diana Hartwell's background with somewhat greater thoroughness, and that might consider whether there existed any connections between Diana and the parish council financial matters beyond what was readily apparent. With these observations, Miss Marple rose to her feet, indicating that her visit was drawing to a conclusion, and assured Margaret that she had been honored to receive such confidential information and that she would treat the matter with the utmost discretion. As Miss Marple walked home through the lengthening afternoon shadows, her mind occupied itself with the information she had received and the questions it had raised. The narrative Margaret had presented seemed to account for many of the observed facts, yet something about it remained incomplete, as though certain crucial elements were missing from the picture. She found herself considering what Margaret had not said, what her careful account had omitted or minimized, and what explanations might exist for various details that remained unexplained. By the time she reached her cottage and settled into her familiar armchair, the pale pink cardigan temporarily abandoned on the side table, Miss Marple had formulated several hypotheses regarding the true nature of the situation, and she had determined that she would require considerably more information before she could determine which hypothesis most closely approached the truth. The days that followed Miss Marple's conversation with Margaret proved to be rich in incident and revelation, though many of the discoveries that emerged seemed to raise more questions than they answered. The village itself had begun to exhibit the peculiar characteristics of a community that sensed significant disruption approaching, but which could not yet identify the precise nature or source of that disruption. Conversations in the post office became guarded. Glances at certain individuals carried new weight and significance, and the normal patter. NS of village gossip had begun to fragment into competing theories and speculations. Miss Marple, maintaining her customary calm demeanor and her outward focus on domestic concerns and village activities, had nevertheless initiated a series of subtle investigations designed to illuminate the true nature of the situation that seemed to be developing beneath the surface of St. Mary Mead's apparently peaceful existence. Her first inquiry had led her to Thomas Whitley, whom she had encountered at the church following the Sunday service. She had engaged him in conversation regarding the parish council's financial matters, approaching the subject with the kind of innocent curiosity that characterized her manner when she wished to elicit information without appearing to seek it deliberately. Thomas, who respected Miss Marple's judgment and who seemed relieved to discuss matters that were clearly causing him considerable concern, had admitted that there had been irregularities discovered in the council's accounts. Irregularities that had been reported to the police and that now seemed likely to become public knowledge within a very short time. He had explained that the irregularities appeared to involve manipulations of funds designated for the village improvement project, specifically involving the diversion of monies into accounts that were not directly associated with any council member or council function. When Miss Marple had inquired whether he possessed any information regarding who might have engineered such manipulations, Thomas had hesitated, and then admitted that suspicion had fallen upon Peter Ashford, though he found this suggestion troubling because Peter was, so far as Thomas was aware, not a council member and would theoretically have limited access to such financial records. This observation, delivered with apparent casualness, but which Miss Marple recognized, as the result of careful consideration, suggested that Thomas possessed a degree of insight into the situation that extended beyond the obvious explanation. She had therefore pursued the matter somewhat further, inquiring whether Thomas thought it likely that Peter could have accessed the necessary financial records without assistance from someone with more direct authority and access. Thomas had become distinctly uncomfortable at this suggestion and had begun to speak in vague generalities about the importance of not making accusations without solid evidence, before politely excusing himself from the conversation. However, in his discomfort and in his evasiveness, Miss Marple had detected something significant. Thomas knew or suspected something regarding the true authorship of the financial irregularities, and his reluctance to discuss it suggested either loyalty to someone, fear of the consequences of disclosure, or some form of complicity that he was anxious to conceal. The second avenue of investigation had involved a more direct approach. Miss Marple had found herself encountering Peter Ashford on the village high street, where he had been purchasing supplies from the general shop. She had engaged him in polite conversation, inquiring after his health and his adjustment to village life, displaying the kind of friendly interest that characterized her interactions with younger residents. Peter, who appeared considerably more troubled than he had in previous encounters, had responded with a politeness that seemed to mask considerable internal distress. When Miss Marple had ventured to mention that she understood there had been some difficulties within the parish council regarding financial matters, Peter's reaction had been immediate and revealing. His face had flushed, his hands had clenched momentarily, and he had begun to speak in rapid defensive tones regarding his complete innocence of any wrongdoing, despite his mother's baseless accusations. His vehemence had suggested not merely defensive protesting, but rather a desperate attempt to convince not only Miss Marple, but himself of his own innocence. Most significantly, when Miss Marple had gently inquired whether he believed that someone else might be responsible for the financial irregularities, Peter had begun to frame what appeared to be an accusation toward Diana before suddenly stopping himself, his expression transforming from angry accusation to something more akin to fear or uncertainty. He had then attempted to modify his statement, claiming that he had simply been confused regarding what had occurred, and that he preferred not to discuss the matter further. However, in that single moment of near disclosure, Miss Marple had perceived something crucial. Peter's suspicion or knowledge that Diana Hartwell was somehow connected to the financial manipulations, coupled with his apparent unwillingness or inability to articulate this suspicion clearly. This combination suggested either that Peter possessed knowledge that he was reluctant to share, or that he suspected Diana of involvement but could not bring himself to accuse her directly, likely due to his continuing emotional attachment to her. The third and most significant piece of investigation had involved a more careful examination of Diana Hartwell's background. Miss Marple had written to her nephew Raymond, who possessed various connections and resources through his professional work in London, requesting discreet inquiry into Diana Hartwell's history, her financial circumstances, and her background prior to her arrival in St. Mary Mead. She had framed the request in deliberately vague terms, suggesting merely that she was interested in learning more about a new village resident and that she thought Raymond might find the matter interesting from an intellectual perspective. Raymond, accustomed to his aunt's occasional requests for investigation into matters of local concern, had not questioned the request, but had instead set about making the appropriate inquiries. The response, which had arrived approximately 4 days later, contained information that proved to be considerably more illuminating than Miss Marple had anticipated. Diana Hartwell, it appeared, was not precisely the person she had presented herself to be. Her background involved a marriage to a financier named Edward Hartwell, who had died approximately 3 years previously under circumstances that, while officially ruled accidental, had attracted some measure of scandal and speculation. Edward Hartwell's death had left Diana as the beneficiary of a substantial financial estate, though not as substantial as it might otherwise have been due to certain complications regarding his business affairs and various financial irregularities that had emerged following his death. More significantly, Diana had been connected through her deceased husband to various financial enterprises and investments, some of which had involved manipulation of accounts and fraudulent misrepresentation. While Diana herself had never been formally accused of any criminal activity, she had been the subject of investigation regarding her potential knowledge of and involvement in certain financial schemes. The investigation had ultimately yielded insufficient evidence for prosecution, but it had left a considerable cloud of suspicion regarding her character and her involvement in questionable financial activities. Furthermore, Raymond's investigation had revealed that Diana's arrival in St. Mary Mead approximately 18 months previously had coincided with the conclusion of a particularly contentious business dispute involving her late husband's estate, a timing that suggested her relocation might have been prompted by a desire to distance herself from scrutiny rather than by any genuine desire to establish residence in a peaceful village community. He had also discovered that Diana possessed no apparent family connections to the area, no prior residence in the vicinity, and no obvious connections to any individuals in St. Mary Mead prior to her arrival, which made her sudden decision to relocate to the village considerably more mysterious than she had suggested. Armed with this information, Miss Marple had begun to reconsider the entire situation in a new light. The narrative that Margaret had presented, that Peter had manipulated parish council funds in an attempt to impress or benefit Diana, remained partially plausible, yet it now seemed equally likely that Diana had deliberately cultivated a relationship with Peter precisely because she had recognized in him someone whose emotional vulnerability and family connections might provide opportunities for financial manipulation. If this were the case, then Peter's involvement in the financial irregularities might not have been driven by romantic obsession, but rather by manipulation and deception orchestrated by someone considerably more calculating and sophisticated than any mere romantic interest. As Miss Marple settled into her armchair that evening, the pale pink cardigan finally abandoned in favor of a more urgent mental occupation, she found herself considering the possibility that the true villain in this situation might not be the emotionally troubled young man blamed by his mother, but rather someone considerably more dangerous, a woman who had deliberately inserted herself into village life and into the Ashford family's affairs for purposes that extended far beyond simple romantic entanglement, purposes that remained to be fully revealed. The Reeve. That Diana Hartwell possessed a questionable financial history and potential involvement in dubious business schemes prompted Miss Marple to undertake a more systematic and considerably more intrusive investigation into Diana's activities since arriving in St. Mary Mead. This investigation, conducted with the kind of discretion and subtlety that characterized all of Miss Marple's methodical inquiries, involved engaging several of the village's residents in conversations ostensibly about entirely different matters, while carefully directing these conversations toward information regarding Diana's associations, her financial circumstances, and her interactions with various village figures. It was a delicate operation that required considerable finesse, as any too obvious attempt to gather information would likely have generated the kind of village gossip and speculation that would have alerted Diana to the fact that her background and activities were attracting scrutiny. One of Miss Marple's most productive conversations had occurred with Jennifer Matthews, the nervous and somewhat timid secretary of the parish council. Jennifer, when carefully approached with expressions of innocent curiosity regarding the logistics of council financial management, had admitted that Diana had on several occasions visited the parish council offices, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for the summer event, but actually, Jennifer suspected, to examine various documents and records. More significantly, Jennifer had mentioned that Diana had on at least one occasion been observed in conversation with Thomas Whitley regarding financial matters, a conversation that had seemed unusually intense and that had concluded with Thomas appearing considerably distressed. When Miss Marple had inquired whether Jennifer possessed any sense of what these conversations might have involved, Jennifer had reluctantly admitted that she had overheard fragments of discussion in which Thomas had mentioned concerns regarding certain financial transactions and had suggested that Diana's involvement in village affairs provided opportunities for mutual benefit if matters were handled with appropriate discretion. This revelation suggested a relationship between Diana and Thomas Whitley that extended considerably beyond casual village acquaintance or innocent business discussion. It implied potential collusion, though the precise nature and extent of that collusion remained unclear. Miss Marple had therefore undertaken to engineer an encounter with Thomas that would allow her to observe his behavior and demeanor when discussing Diana, and to determine whether she might discern any indication of the true nature of their relationship. She had encountered him at the library, where she had been returning several books regarding historical village records, and had engaged him in conversation regarding the summer event planning. When she had mentioned Diana's apparent enthusiasm for participating in the various festivities, Thomas's reaction had been immediate and revealing. He had become distinctly uncomfortable. His responses had become evasive, and he had exhibited all the characteristic signs of someone attempting to conceal information or anxiety regarding a particular individual or situation. Miss Marple had therefore determined that she would benefit from a more direct conversation with Thomas, one conducted in an environment where he might feel sufficiently comfortable to speak with greater candor. She had accordingly invited Thomas to her cottage for afternoon tea, extending the invitation in such a manner that he could not reasonably refuse without causing offense or generating curiosity regarding his reluctance. When Thomas had arrived at her cottage on the specified afternoon, Miss Marple had observed that he appeared considerably more anxious than she had previously noted, suggesting that he had spent the intervening time anticipating this conversation and had arrived with considerable apprehension regarding what might transpire. They had engaged in the customary social formalities, tea was served, cakes were offered, and initial conversation had covered safe and innocuous topics, before Miss Marple had gradually directed the discussion toward matters of somewhat greater significance. She had begun by observing, in her characteristic gentle manner, that she had noted Thomas seemed to be considerably troubled by various matters, and that she wondered whether there might be something that was causing him concern. Thomas had initially resisted this invitation to confidentiality, claiming that he was merely occupied with various parish council responsibilities and that nothing of particular significance was troubling him. However, Miss Marple had persisted with her gentle inquiries, suggesting that she had observed certain patterns in his behavior and demeanor that suggested something more substantial than mere administrative concern, and that she had long ago discovered that sometimes it was beneficial to discuss matters with someone outside one's immediate circumstances. Faced with such direct but tactful observation, and perhaps recognizing that Miss Marple possessed information regarding his interactions with Diana Hartwell, Thomas had gradually begun to relent in his resistance. What emerged from Thomas's reluctant confession was the following narrative. Approximately 1 year previously, Thomas had begun to experience significant financial difficulties. His pension from his years of service as a local businessman had proven insufficient to cover various expenses, and he had begun to consider whether there might be ways to supplement his income through his position on the parish council. Diana Hartwell, recognizing his financial vulnerability and his proximity to the council's financial records, had approached him with a proposal that, while not explicitly illegal, operated in the gray areas between legitimate business practice and fraudulent activity. She had proposed that certain funds designated for the village improvement project might be diverted into temporary investments managed by associates of hers, investments that would generate returns sufficient to benefit both Diana and Thomas, and that would subsequently be returned to the council's accounts in their entirety before any irregularities could be detected. Thomas had initially resisted this proposal, recognizing the ethical and legal implications of such an arrangement. However, Diana had proven to be remarkably persistent and remarkably skilled in her methods of persuasion. She had gradually increased the financial incentives she offered, had flattered Thomas regarding his business acumen and his potential for higher returns than he might achieve through more conservative investments, and had suggested that such arrangements were common practice in many communities and that his reluctance was merely the result of excessive caution. Over time, Thomas had allowed himself to be persuaded, and he had agreed to facilitate the transfer of council funds into the accounts Diana had specified. The arrangement had functioned for several months without apparent difficulty, and Thomas had indeed received financial returns that had significantly improved his financial circumstances. However, when Miss Marple had inquired regarding the current status of the arrangement and whether the funds had been returned to the council's accounts in their entirety, Thomas had become noticeably more distressed. He had admitted, with considerable reluctance and evident shame, that the funds had not been fully returned, that certain portions of the money appeared to have been diverted into accounts that he could not trace or access, and that Diana had recently become evasive regarding his inquiries about the status of the investments and the timeline for returning the council's money. He had furthermore admitted that Peter Ashford's involvement in the scheme appeared to have been recruited by Diana, who had persuaded Peter that his participation in the financial transactions would demonstrate his financial sophistication and his capability to manage substantial sums, and that this demonstrated capability would somehow impress Diana and prove his worthiness as a potential romantic partner. As Thomas had recounted these revelations, Miss Marple had listened with careful attention, occasionally asking clarifying questions that seemed designed to ensure she understood the particulars of the situation rather than to express judgment or criticism of Thomas's conduct. When Thomas had finished his confession and was awaiting her response, clearly dreading condemnation or threats of exposure, Miss Marple had regarded him with an expression that combined compassion with a kind of stern awareness of his moral culpability. She had observed that his situation, while serious, was not irretrievable, and that certain steps might be undertaken to mitigate the consequences of his poor judgment. However, she had also suggested that the most important task before them was not protecting Thomas from the consequences of his actions, but rather determining the true extent of Diana Hartwell's crimes and ensuring that she faced appropriate accountability for her deliberate deception and manipulation of multiple individuals within the village community. It was at this point that Thomas, finally understanding the true severity of the situation and the calculated nature of Diana's orchestration of events, had begun to comprehend that he had been merely one of several victims of a considerably more extensive and sophisticated scheme than he had previously recognized. The information that Miss Marple extracted from Thomas Whitley provided her with a considerably more comprehensive understanding of the situation, yet it simultaneously raised new questions regarding the precise extent and ultimate purpose of Diana Hartwell's elaborate scheme. It was clear that Diana had deliberately cultivated relationships with multiple individuals within the village: Thomas Whitley for his access to financial records and his financial vulnerabilities, Peter Ashford for his family connections and his emotional susceptibility, and Margaret Ashford herself, though Miss Marple had not yet fully discerned what Diana's relationship with Margaret might represent beyond simple village acquaintance. The question that now occupied Miss Marple's thoughts was not merely whether Diana had orchestrated financial manipulations, but rather what her ultimate objective might be. What end goal had motivated such elaborate and calculated deception? Simple financial gain seemed insufficient to account for the complexity and sophistication of Diana's machinations, and Miss Marple found herself considering whether there might be additional motivations lurking beneath the surface of the apparent scheme. Following her conversation with Thomas, Miss Marple had undertaken to share certain elements of her discoveries with Inspector Hartbury, contacting him through official channels and requesting a private conversation. They had met in her cottage, where Miss Marple had presented the information she had accumulated with careful precision, explaining Thomas's confession and his description of the financial arrangement that Diana had orchestrated. Inspector Hartbury had listened to this account with the focused attention of a professional investigator, making notes and asking occasional questions designed to clarify specific details. When Miss Marple had concluded her recitation, the inspector had acknowledged that her information corroborated certain aspects of their own investigation, while revealing details that had not previously emerged through the official inquiry. He had also indicated in carefully measured language that the situation appeared to be considerably more complex than the initial evidence had suggested, and that Diana Hartwell was proving to be a considerably more elusive and sophisticated subject than they had anticipated. What the inspector had revealed in turn was that their investigation into the parish council financial irregularities had uncovered evidence of a pattern extending far beyond the simple diversion of village funds. The investigation had discovered that funds transferred from the parish council accounts had been moved through a series of intermediary accounts maintained by various financial entities, many of which appeared to be fictitious or to exist primarily for the purpose of disguising the ultimate destination of the transferred money. Furthermore, certain of the transferred funds appeared to trace back to accounts associated with Diana's late husband's financial enterprises, suggesting that Diana might be utilizing the parish council scheme as a mechanism for recovering or accessing funds that she believed to be legitimately hers, but which had been frozen or otherwise restricted following her husband's death and the subsequent investigations into his business practices. This revelation prompted Miss Marple to reconsider the entire situation from a new perspective. It appeared that Diana's motivation might not be simple greed or financial opportunism, but rather something considerably more personal and vindictive. She seemed to be engaged in an elaborate scheme not merely to steal from the village, but to utilize the parish council's financial resources as a mechanism for accessing or recovering funds that she believed had been wrongfully withheld from her following her husband's death. Furthermore, her cultivation of relationships with various village figures suggested that she might be deliberately inserting herself into village life precisely to position herself in proximity to financial resources and administrative structures that she could exploit for her purposes. Armed with this revised understanding of Diana's motivations and the scope of her scheme, Miss Marple began to consider the question that had been troubling her throughout the investigation. What specific trigger or catalyst had prompted Diana to undertake such an elaborate and risky scheme in a small English village, where her activities would eventually become apparent to official scrutiny? The answer to this question came from an unexpected source when Miss Marple received a visitor late one afternoon, a woman who identified herself as Margaret Ashford's sister, Helen Pemberton, who had arrived in the village specifically to discuss certain matters with Miss Marple in private. Helen Pemberton was a woman of approximately Margaret's age, though with a considerably warmer demeanor and a tendency toward greater emotional expressiveness than her sister displayed. She had come to St. Mary Mead upon discovering that Miss Marple was investigating the circumstances surrounding Diana Hartwell and the financial irregularities, information she had obtained through her sister Margaret, who had confided to Helen her concerns regarding Diana and her increasingly troubling suspicions regarding Diana's true nature and motivations. Helen had come to provide Miss Marple with information regarding a discovery she had made while searching through certain papers in Margaret's study at her request. Among Margaret's personal documents, Helen had discovered correspondence between Margaret and an individual claiming to be a representative of her late mother's estate, a representative offering substantial financial compensation to Margaret in relation to certain business disputes that had arisen following her mother's death approximately 5 years previously. The correspondence suggested that Margaret's mother, whom Miss Marple had never actually encountered in her years in the village but whose death she had heard referenced, had been involved in various business dealings with Edward Hartwell, Diana's late husband. The business disputes that had followed the older woman's death had apparently been resolved through legal proceedings, with certain funds having been awarded to the Ashford family, but with other claimed amounts remaining in dispute. According to the correspondence Helen had discovered, these disputed funds had been frozen in various accounts pending the resolution of certain litigation, and Margaret had been informed that the outstanding amounts might potentially be recovered if she were willing to provide certain documentation and information regarding the nature of the original business arrangements. The significance of this discovery became immediately apparent to Miss Marple. It suggested that Diana Hartwell had deliberately targeted the Ashford family specifically because of Margaret's mother's prior business dealings with Edward Hartwell. Diana had likely researched the disputed funds and the complicated history of the business relationships, and had then orchestrated her arrival in St. Mary Mead and her integration into village society specific ally to position herself to exploit these connections. She had cultivated a relationship with Peter Ashford, utilizing his emotional vulnerability to facilitate her access to village financial systems, and she had simultaneously positioned herself to gather information from Margaret and other village figures regarding the disputed estate matters. This revelation suggested a psychological sophistication and a capacity for long-term planning that elevated Diana from the status of simple financial opportunist to something considerably more dangerous, a woman capable of nursing grudges across years and continents, of meticulously researching her targets, and of orchestrating elaborate schemes that manipulated multiple individuals for the purpose of achieving her personal objectives. As Miss Marple sat with Helen Pemberton in her parlor, discussing these revelations and contemplating their implications, she found herself increasingly convinced that she was dealing with a situation considerably more sinister than a simple case of financial manipulation or romantic deception. Diana Hartwell represented something considerably more troubling, a calculating intelligence deployed in service of vengeance and a willingness to destroy lives and disrupt communities in pursuit of her personal objectives. By the time Helen Pemberton departed from Miss Marple's cottage that evening, Miss Marple had determined that the situation had reached a critical point, and that events were likely to accelerate toward some kind of resolution. She had accumulated sufficient evidence and sufficient understanding of Diana's true nature and motivations to recognize that the situation could not continue indefinitely without resulting in genuine harm to various individuals within the village. She had therefore resolved to undertake a course of action that would force events toward their inevitable conclusion, and that would provide Diana with the opportunity to reveal herself completely, thereby confirming Miss Marple's theories regarding her guilt and her motivations. The question that now occupied Miss Marple's thoughts was not whether Diana was guilty, but rather what additional crimes or deceptions remained to be uncovered, and what catalyst might prove necessary to precipitate the final revelation that would expose the true extent of Diana's calculated malevolence. Miss Marple's decision to force events toward their inevitable conclusion manifested itself in a carefully orchestrated series of actions designed to create circumstances that would compel Diana to reveal herself completely. The first element of this strategy involved a seemingly innocuous social gathering, a small tea party to be held at Miss Marple's cottage, to which she would invite a carefully selected group of village residents including Diana Hartwell, Margaret Ashford, Thomas Whitley, and Peter Ashford. The ostensible purpose of this gathering was to discuss the final arrangements for the summer event and to celebrate the village's community spirit. But the true purpose represented something considerably more significant. It would provide Miss Marple with the opportunity to observe all the key figures in this elaborate drama simultaneously, to note their interactions with one another, and, most importantly, to introduce certain pieces of information that she believed would provoke revealing reactions from Diana herself. The invitations had been issued with Miss Marple's characteristic courtesy, each phrased in language that made refusal difficult without appearing rude or suspicious. Diana had accepted with apparent enthusiasm, expressing pleasure at the opportunity to participate in village social gatherings. Margaret had accepted with a qualified relief, suggesting that she welcomed the opport. Unity to move forward with village activities despite the difficulties that had beset her family. Thomas had accepted with clear reluctance, his anxiety regarding the impending gathering evident in his hesitant response. Peter had declined initially before later, reversing his decision and confirming his attendance, a reversal that Miss Marple correctly interpreted as resulting from pressure or persuasion from his mother. On the afternoon of the gathering, Miss Marple had prepared her cottage with meticulous care, arranging refreshments, selecting her finest china, and positioning herself strategically within her parlor where she could observe all the guests without appearing to do so as the guests arrived, and settled into the familiar spaces of Miss Marple's sitting room, the atmosphere became almost tangibly tense, despite the social pleasantries being exchanged. Margaret had appeared apprehensive, clearly uncertain regarding the purpose of the gathering, and why Miss Marple had chosen this particular moment to host such an event. Thomas had been noticeably nervous, his hands trembling slightly as he accepted tea and a small plate of biscuits. Peter had seemed confused, uncertain regarding how he should conduct himself in the presence of Diana, who appeared entirely composed and at ease, displaying none of the anxiety that characterized the other guests. Diana had greeted everyone with warm courtesy, had complimented Miss Marple's decorations and refreshments, and had settled herself into the most comfortable chair with the kind of easy confidence that suggested she was entirely unaware that she was under any form of suspicion or scrutiny. It was only after everyone had consumed tea and had become sufficiently settled that Miss Marple had begun to broach the subject that had prompted this gathering. She had commenced with a comment regarding the difficulties that had recently afflicted the village, expressing her regret that such complications should disturb the peaceful existence of the community. She had then observed, in her characteristically gentle manner, that she had always found it remarkable how human communities operated on the basis of mutual trust and confidence, and how readily that trust could be violated by individuals who had deliberately infiltrated those communities for purposes of personal gain or personal vengeance. The comment, while couched in abstract language, had carried sufficient implication that Thomas had shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and Diana had paused momentarily in the act of lifting her teacup to her lips. Miss Marple had then proceeded, with deliberate care, to recount the history of the parish council's financial irregularities in considerable detail, describing the mechanisms by which funds had been diverted, the intermediary accounts through which money had been transferred, and the patterns of financial manipulation that had been discovered through careful investigation. She had presented this information in a manner that suggested she possessed considerable knowledge of the specifics of the scheme, though she had been careful to attribute her knowledge to official investigation rather than to any personal inquiry. She had observed that such schemes typically required the cooperation of multiple individuals, each of whom had been motivated by different considerations, some by financial incentive, some by emotional vulnerability, and some by a combination of factors that made them susceptible to manipulation by a more calculating intelligence. It was at this point that Miss Marple had turned her attention specifically to Diana, regarding her with a kind of gentle but penetrating gaze that suggested considerably greater knowledge than Diana had been aware that Miss Marple possessed. Shh. Had remarked that she found it particularly interesting when individuals arrived in villages with no apparent connections to the community, no obvious reasons for choosing such places as residence, and no clear family or social motivations for their relocation. She had suggested that in her experience, such arrivals often concealed considerably more complex motivations than appeared on the surface, and that she had long ago learned to regard such apparent coincidences with considerable skepticism and curiosity. Diana's response to these observations had been calculated and composed. She had maintained her pleasant expression, had set down her teacup with careful precision, and had responded with a series of vague generalities regarding the attractions of village life and the pleasures of community involvement. However, Miss Marple had detected in her response a subtle shift in Diana's demeanor, a tightening of tension around her eyes, and a quality to her smile that suggested she was operating on pure willpower and careful control. Miss Marple had then introduced the final element of her carefully orchestrated scenario by remarking, almost as an afterthought, that she had recently been corresponding with her nephew regarding certain matters of mutual interest, and that through this correspondence she had learned some fascinating details regarding the financial history of certain individuals who had relocated to St. Mary Mead. The effect of this comment had been immediate and striking. Diana's composure, which had until that moment remained essentially intact, had fractured perceptibly. Her hand had trembled as she set down her cup. Her breathing had become noticeably more rapid, and a flush had risen in her cheeks despite her evident attempt to maintain control. She had begun to speak, her words tumbling out in rapid succession, no longer carefully modulated, but instead raw and genuine, expressing rage, bitterness, and years of accumulated resentment regarding the injustices she believed had been inflicted upon her following her husband's death. She had described the frozen assets, the litigation that had consumed years and substantial resources, the sense of violation she had experienced when her husband's business associates and their families had maneuvered to exclude her from rightful access to their shared wealth. She had admitted, in the raw emotional urgency of her disclosure, that she had deliberately researched the connections between the Ashford family and her late husband's financial enterprises, that she had deliberately relocated to St. Mary Mead specifically to position herself in proximity to financial resources she believed she could exploit, and that she had quite deliberately cultivated relationships with various village residents, precisely because she had recognized their vulnerabilities and had calculated that they could be manipulated into cooperation with her schemes. She had acknowledged manipulating Peter Ashford, had described with cold precision how she had recognized his emotional vulnerability and had exploited it systematically, and had admitted that her ultimate objective had been to gather information from the Ashford family regarding the disputed estate matters while simultaneously utilizing the parish council scheme as a mechanism for accessing frozen funds, as Diana's confession had poured forth, transforming the quiet parlor into a space charged with genuine emotional intensity. The other guests had reacted with shock and dismay. Margaret had appeared devastated, her worst suspicions regarding Diana's true nature confirmed absolutely. Thomas had seemed to shrink into himself, apparently realizing the full extent to which he had been manipulated by someone considerably more sophisticated and more ruthless than he had previously comprehended. Peter had stared at Diana with an expression combining betrayal, anguish, and the kind of clarity that comes when romantic illusions are finally and irrevocably shattered. And Miss Marple, observing all of this with her characteristic calm, had recognized that she had successfully engineered precisely the moment she had anticipated, the moment when calculated deception would give way to raw truth, when carefully maintained facades would crumble, and when the true nature of Diana's crimes would be exposed not through legal procedures or police investigation, but through the operation of psychology and human nature, the instruments with which Miss Marple had always been most proficient. The silence that followed Diana's emotional confession seemed to extend indefinitely, a silence so profound that it appeared almost to have physical weight and substance within the confines of Miss Marple's small parlor. Diana herself seemed to have exhausted herself through the raw intensity of her disclosure, and she had subsided into her chair with the kind of stillness that suggested emotional collapse. Her face, which moments before had been flushed with the intensity of her anger and resentment, had become noticeably paler, and her hands lay folded in her lap with the kind of inert quality that suggested she had suddenly become aware of the implications of what she had just revealed. The other occupants of the room remained motionless, each apparently processing the confession in their own manner and according to their own particular capacities for understanding and emotional response. It was Miss Marple who, after what seemed an appropriate interval, spoke first, her voice maintaining its characteristic gentle quality, despite the gravity of the circumstances that had just unfolded. She had observed that she found herself in a somewhat delicate position, having orchestrated this gathering specifically to elicit the truth regarding Diana's activities and motivations, yet now finding herself possessed of knowledge that carried significant legal implications, and that therefore could not be ignored or treated merely as a matter of private village concern. She had suggested that she believed the appropriate course of action would involve notifying Inspector Hartbury of the confession that had just been made, thereby allowing official legal procedures to proceed according to established protocols. She had furthermore observed that while Diana's actions had been motivated by genuine grievances regarding the injustices she had experienced following her husband's death, her deliberate manipulation of multiple individuals and her orchestration of financial crimes represented conduct that could not be overlooked or excused, regardless of the sympathetic nature of her underlying motivations. Diana had not attempted to deny what she had revealed or to retract any portion of her confession. Instead, she had responded to Miss Marple's suggestions with a kind of resigned acceptance that suggested she had anticipated this eventual outcome, and had perhaps even recognized on some level that her elaborate scheme could not continue indefinitely without ultimate exposure and accountability. She had acknowledged that she understood the implications of what she had disclosed, and she had expressed a kind of bitter acceptance regarding the consequences that would inevitably follow. She had noted, with a quality of dark irony that suggested she had not completely lost her capacity for sardonic observation, despite her emotional turmoil, that she had constructed her scheme with such elaborate care precisely because she had recognized that it would eventually be discovered, and that she had perhaps been unconsciously motivated by a desire to finally confront and be confronted regarding the injustices she had experienced. Miss Marple had then proceeded to contact Inspector Hartbury by telephone, speaking to him in measured tones and requesting that he visit her cottage at his earliest convenience to discuss a matter of considerable importance. While they awaited the inspector's arrival, Miss Marple had maintained a careful control over the situation, ensuring that Diana remained present and that the other guests remained composed, despite the emotional intensity of the circumstances. She had offered additional refreshment, had engaged in neutral conversation regarding various village matters, and had demonstrated through her comportment a kind of steady reliability and calm acceptance of events that seemed to have a stabilizing effect on the other occupants of the room. When Inspector Hartbury had arrived approximately 30 minutes later, he had been presented with the remarkable sight of a group of village residents assembled in Miss Marple's parlor, including the individual he had been investigating for financial crimes, and who had now apparently confessed to those crimes in considerable detail. The inspector had taken charge of the situation with professional efficiency, explaining to Diana her rights and the procedures that would be followed, and arranging for her to be taken into custody pending formal charges. Before Diana had departed Miss Marple's cottage in the company of the inspector and a police constable, she had paused momentarily and had looked directly at Miss Marple with an expression that combined acknowledgement, respect, and something that might have been gratitude. She had remarked, in a voice that was quiet but sufficiently audible for those present to hear, that she had perhaps underestimated Miss Marple, that she had assumed that an elderly woman residing quietly in a small village would represent no threat to her carefully constructed schemes, and that she had failed to recognize that genuine intelligence and understanding of human nature could manifest itself in forms and in individuals that one might not anticipate. She had further observed that she had, in some fashion that she could not entirely articulate, recognized during her time in the village that Miss Marple possessed a quality of perception and insight that exceeded that of most individuals, yet she had chosen to believe that this perception would remain focused on minor social observations rather than on her own conduct and motivations. It was, Diana had suggested, a failure of imagination on her part, a failure to recognize that someone who understood human nature with sufficient depth could eventually be expected to perceive through the carefully constructed facades of deception and calculate the hidden patterns that underlay apparently innocent social interactions. Following Diana's departure, the remaining occupants of Miss Marple's parlor had required some time to process the events that had transpired and to arrive at appropriate responses and reactions. Margaret had appeared devastated yet simultaneously relieved, as though the confirmation of her suspicions regarding Diana's true nature, while confirming her worst fears regarding her son's manipulation, had at least provided a framework within which the complicated events of recent weeks could be understood and contextualized. She expressed gratitude toward Miss Marple for her role in orchestrating Diana's confession and for her willingness to undertake the investigation that had ultimately exposed the truth of the situation. She had furthermore acknowledged, with evident pain, that her own judgment regarding both Diana and her son Peter had been considerably less reliable than she might have preferred, and that she would require considerable time to process the implications of these revelations for her family relationships. Peter had appeared profoundly affected by the confirmation that his emotional attachment to Diana had been deliberately cultivated and manipulated by someone who had never genuinely cared for him beyond his utility to her schemes. He had struggled to articulate his feelings, oscillating between anger at Diana's deception, shame regarding his own role in the financial irregularities, and a kind of anguished recognition that he had permitted his emotional vulnerability to be exploited so thoroughly and so systematically. He had thanked Miss Marple quietly, his words carrying the weight of genuine contrition and a recognition of his own culpability in the events that had transpired, regardless of the mitigating circumstances of Diana's manipulation. Thomas Whitley had remained relatively silent during the aftermath of Diana's departure, but his expression had suggested a man who was confronting the full implications of his own conduct and the ways in which his personal weaknesses and his financial vulnerabilities had made him susceptible to manipulation by someone considerably more intelligent and considerably more ruthless than he had been willing to acknowledge. He had left Miss Marple's cottage with evident relief once it became clear that his participation in the scheme would likely receive more lenient treatment given his cooperation with the official investigation and his role in providing evidence against Diana. As evening fell and the last of her guests had departed, Miss Marple had settled into her familiar armchair, her pale pink cardigan finally retrieved and placed across her lap, though she had made no attempt to continue working on it. She had gazed out the window at the quiet streets of St. Mary Mead, at the gardens visible beyond the sea, cottage walls where the evening light was casting long shadows across the flowers and foliage, and she had reflected on the ways in which apparently peaceful communities could conceal profound complexities, significant deceptions, and the capacity of human beings for both genuine malevolence and genuine vulnerability. She had recognized that while Diana's crimes were genuine and required legal accountability, Diana herself represented something considerably more complex than simple villainy. She represented instead a person who had allowed legitimate grievances and genuine injustices to transform into something darker and more destructive, who had permitted herself to become consumed by resentment and vengeance in ways that ultimately had proved self-destructive. The days and weeks that followed Diana Hartwell's arrest and the subsequent legal proceedings proceeded with a quality of inevitability that seemed almost scripted, as though events were now simply fulfilling their predetermined paths without requiring further intervention or manipulation. The official investigation into the parish council financial irregularities had been completed with considerably greater expedition than might otherwise have been expected, accelerated by Diana's confession and by the cooperation of Thomas Whitley, who had provided detailed documentation regarding the financial transfers and the mechanisms by which funds had been diverted from council accounts. The Crown Prosecution Service had brought charges against Diana for fraud, conspiracy, and related financial crimes, charges that she had not contested and to which she had eventually pleaded guilty, thereby avoiding the necessity of a prolonged trial that would have maintained the village's focus on the scandal for an extended period. The trial itself had taken place in the county town, conducted before a judge and jury, and had a track. A measure of media attention given the apparent sophistication of Diana's scheme and the somewhat unusual context of a small village community being the venue for financial crimes of considerable complexity. Various witnesses had been called to testify, including Thomas Whitley, Peter Ashford, Margaret Ashford, and various officials from both the police investigation and the parish council. Miss Marple had not been required to testify, as her role had been that of private investigator rather than official witness to any of the crimes themselves, though her contributions to the investigation had been acknowledged by the prosecuting attorneys and had been noted in the various reports and documents that had been generated through the official proceedings. Diana had conducted herself throughout the trial with a kind of composed dignity that had attracted a measure of sympathetic attention from certain quarters of the press and public opinion. She had made a statement to the court in which she had not attempted to excuse her conduct, but had instead provided context regarding her motivations, describing the injustices she had experienced following her husband's death, the years of legal struggles regarding frozen assets and disputed claims, and the gradual transformation of her legitimate grievances into something considerably darker and more destructive. She had acknowledged that she had allowed her sense of victimization to justify increasingly unethical and criminal conduct, and that she had permitted herself to become consumed by resentment and vengeance in ways that had ultimately harmed not only her intended targets but also various innocent individuals who had become entangled in her schemes through no fault of their own. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, had acknowledged the sympathetic elements of Diana's background and the genuine injustices she had experienced, while simultaneously emphasizing that such circumstances could not excuse or mitigate the deliberate nature of her criminal conduct or the calculated ways in which she had manipulated and deceived multiple individuals. He had sentenced her to 5 years' imprisonment, a sentence that had been regarded by most observers as representing a balance between appropriate accountability and recognition of the mitigating circumstances that had contributed to her criminality. Diana had received the sentence with apparent acceptance and had been remanded into custody to begin serving her sentence immediately. The aftermath of the trial had involved considerable adjustment for various individuals within the village community. Thomas Whitley, having cooperated fully with the investigation and having demonstrated genuine remorse regarding his participation in the financial scheme, had not been prosecuted, though he had been required to resign from the parish council and had been subjected to considerable social disapproval and ostracism from various segments of village society. He had subsequently moved from St. Mary Mead to a neighboring town, apparently preferring to distance himself from a community in which he had become such a prominent symbol of moral compromise and poor judgment. His departure had been marked by no particular fanfare or ceremony, merely the quiet acknowledgement that he was no longer present and that the village had moved on to other matters and other preoccupations. Peter Ashford had required considerably more time to process the implications of his experience and the ways in which his emotional vulnerability had been so thoroughly exploited. He had remained in St. Mary Mead for several months, following Diana's conviction, apparently attempting to rebuild his legal practice and his relationships with his family, though his efforts had been complicated by the lingering social stigma associated with his role in the financial crimes. Eventually, he had decided to relocate his practice to a larger town, a decision that had been received by his mother with evident relief, suggesting that Margaret felt her family might benefit from distance and a fresh start in a community where their involvement in the scandal would be less immediately present and less constantly recalled. Margaret Ashford had emerged from the affair with her social position and her reputation essentially intact, though she had experienced what appeared to be a profound shift in her understanding of human nature and her confidence in her own judgment. She had continued her involvement in various village activities and organizations, yet she had apparently developed a considerably more cautious approach to social relationships and village affairs, a wariness that suggested she had internalized the lesson that apparent trustworthiness could mask considerably more complex and darker realities. She had remained gracious toward Miss Marple, expressing repeated gratitude for her role in exposing the truth and in ensuring that the crimes did not go undetected or unpunished. The village of St. Mary Mead itself had gradually returned to its customary rhythms and patterns, though the events of recent months had left their mark on the community's collective consciousness. There had been considerable discussion, gossip, and analysis regarding how Diana had managed to deceive so many people for so long. What warning signs might have been recognized had people been more attentive or more skeptical, and what this entire affair revealed about the nature of village life and the capacity of communities to conceal darker undercurrents beneath their apparent surfaces of peace and propriety. Various residents had engaged in reconsideration of their own interactions with DIA. Wondering whether they had missed opportunities to perceive her true nature, or whether they had been deliberately manipulated in ways they had not fully recognized. The property that Diana had occupied, Whitmore Lodge, had stood vacant for several weeks following her arrest, the subject of considerable speculation regarding what would eventually become of the residence and whether any new resident would be welcomed or viewed with suspicion and caution. Eventually, the property had been let to a family from London who appeared to have no awareness of the property's recent history and who had settled into village life with apparent contentment, becoming absorbed into the normal patterns of village social interaction without generating the kind of mystery and intrigue that had characterized Diana's arrival and presence. Miss Marple had returned to her customary routines and occupations with apparent equanimity, though those residents of St. Mary Mead who possessed the capacity for careful observation had noted that she seemed to regard the village and its residents with a somewhat deeper understanding than might have been evident prior to the affair. She had completed her pale pink cardigan during the period following Diana's trial and had subsequently begun new projects with her customary dedication and skill. She had continued her participation in various village organizations and activities, continued her attendance at church services, continued her correspondence with her nephew Raymond, and had settled back into the rhythms of quiet village life that had characterized her existence for so many years. Yet those who knew her well and who possessed sufficient insight to perceive what her external composure might conceal would have recognized that her experience with Diana Hartwell had not left her unchanged, her understanding of human nature, already profound and de-nuanced, had been enriched by this particular encounter with deliberate malevolence and calculated deception. She had been reminded that genuine danger and genuine criminality could disguise themselves in pleasant exteriors and could operate within apparently safe and stable communities. She had been reminded that the most dangerous individuals were often those who possessed sufficient intelligence to understand human psychology and sufficient ruthlessness to exploit that understanding without hesitation or remorse. and she had been reminded that her own role as observer and occasional intervener in village affairs carried with it a responsibility to remain vigilant and alert to the patterns and anomalies that might suggest that something darker was unfolding beneath the surface of apparent normalcy and peace. Several months had passed since Diana Hartwell's conviction and imprisonment when the village of St. Mary Mead began to exhibit the subtle signs of returning to its customary state of relative tranquility and ordinary preoccupation with the minor concerns and pleasures that characterized village life. The autumn had arrived with its customary display of changing foliage and gradually shortening days, and the village had begun its annual transition toward the quieter rhythms that characterized the colder months. The Women's Institute had commenced their autumn lecture series, the church had begun planning for the Christmas festival, and the various social organizations that structured village life had resumed their regular schedules following the disruption occasioned by the summer's dramatic events. It was in the context of this gradual return to normalcy that Miss Marple found herself reflecting with a kind of contemplative quietness on the nature of the events she had witnessed and the insights they had provided regarding human nature, community, and the sea. Complex ways in which apparently stable social structures could be disrupted by the deliberate malevolence of a single determined individual. Miss Marple had received, several weeks after Diana's imprisonment had begun, a letter from Diana herself, a communication that had arrived bearing a prison postmark and that had been forwarded through official channels. The letter had been written in a careful, controlled hand and had contained neither plea for assistance nor request for reconsideration of her sentence. Instead, Diana had written to Miss Marple with an apparent desire to articulate certain reflections regarding their encounter and regarding the ways in which her elaborate schemes had ultimately proved self-defeating. She had expressed a kind of respectful acknowledgement of Miss Marple's role in exposing her crimes, and had suggested that she had come to recognize, during her months in prison and through considerable time devoted to reflection and self-examination, that she had perhaps possessed certain capacities for understanding and manipulation that might have been employed toward considerably more constructive purposes had she chosen to direct them in different directions. Diana had written that she had come to understand, through the perspective provided by imprisonment and by separation from the society in which she had operated, that her genuine grievances regarding the injustices she had experienced had been real and had been deserving of redress, but that she had permitted those grievances to transform into something that had ultimately consumed her, and that had led her toward conduct that had caused harm to innocent individuals who bore no responsibility for the original injustices. She had acknowledged that Miss Marple had demonstrated, through the process of exposing her crimes, a form of understanding of human psychology and human motivation that exceeded her own, and that she had come to respect Miss Marple's capacity to perceive through deception and manipulation to the underlying truths of human character and conduct. Diana's letter had concluded with an expression of gratitude toward Miss Marple for having forced her, through the exposure of her crimes and the imposition of legal accountability, to confront the full implications of her conduct and to undertake the kind of self-examination that might eventually lead toward some form of genuine transformation or redemption. Miss Marple had responded to Diana's letter with a communication that was characteristically brief and measured, yet that conveyed a kind of compassionate understanding of Diana's situation, while simultaneously maintaining a clear moral stance regarding her conduct. Miss Marple had written that she believed individuals possessed the capacity to change and to transform their understanding of their own conduct, and that she hoped Diana would utilize her time in prison to undertake genuine self-examination and reflection. However, Miss Marple had also noted that such transformation required considerably more than mere recognition of one's errors. It required sustained commitment to different patterns of thinking and conduct, and it required a fundamental reorientation of one's values and priorities. She had suggested that Diana might consider directing her considerable intelligence and her demonstrated capacity for planning and analysis toward endeavors that might contribute positively to society, rather than toward schemes designed for personal vengeance and gain. She had concluded her letter with a gentle observation that Miss Marple had learned, over many decades of observing human nature, that redemption was possible, but only for those who genuinely committed themselves to undertaking the difficult work that such redemption required. The correspondence with Diana had prompted Miss Marple to reflect more broadly on the questions that the entire affair had raised regarding the nature of evil, the origins of criminality, and the ways in which apparently stable communities could harbor individuals capable of considerable harm and deception. She had recognized that Diana Hartwell did not fit the conventional patterns of villainy that appeared in detective novels and mystery stories. Diana had not been driven solely by greed or by sadistic pleasure in causing harm to others. Instead, Diana had been motivated by genuine grievances, by a sense of profound injustice regarding the treatment she had received following her husband's death, and by a conviction that she had been wrongfully deprived of resources that were legitimately hers. Yet Miss Marple had also recognized that Diana's very genuineness regarding these grievances, combined with her intelligence and her lack of ethical constraints, had made her considerably more dangerous than an individual motivated by simple criminal impulse or by obvious psychological pathology. This recognition had prompted Miss Marple to consider the various individuals who had become entangled in Diana's schemes: Thomas Whitley, Peter Ashford, and others within the village, and to reflect on the ways in which their own vulnerabilities and their own moral compromises had made them susceptible to Diana's manipulation. Thomas had been motivated by financial desperation, and by a desire for security. Peter had been motivated by emotional vulnerability and by a yearning for romantic connection and recognition. Neither had possessed the kind of evil intent that might have justified their participation in financial crimes, yet neither had possessed sufficient moral courage to resist the temptations and the inducements that Diana had offered. Miss Marple had recognized that this pattern reflected something fundamentally true about human nature, that most individuals were not simply virtuous or simply vicious, but rather existed at various points along a spectrum of moral capability and moral compromise, susceptible to transformation in various directions depending on the circumstances and the temptations they encountered. What Miss Marple had found particularly illuminating about her investigation into Diana's affairs was the way in which careful observation of human behavior and psychological patterns could provide insights that more direct forms of inquiry might not yield. She had observed subtle shifts in demeanor, small inconsistencies in narrative, and minor contradictions in behavior that had gradually accumulated into a pattern that suggested deception and manipulation. She had recognized that Diana's composure and her pleasant manner represented a deliberate performance rather than a genuine expression of character, and she had perceived in Diana's interactions with various village residents the calculated nature of her cultivation of relationships and trust. These observations had been possible only because Miss Marple possessed sufficient experience with human nature and sufficient practice in observing behavioral patterns to recognize when something was amiss beneath the surface of ordinary social interaction. As autumn had progressed toward winter, Miss Marple had found herself increasingly occupied with the ordinary concerns of village life, organizing various parish activities, attending to her correspondence, managing the maintenance of her cottage, and continuing her needlework with the kind of steady dedication that had characterized her behavior for decades. Yet beneath this surface of ordinary occupation, her mind had continued to process and reflect upon the events she had witnessed and the insights they had provided regarding the complexity of human motivation and the ways in which apparently peaceful communities could conceal significant darkness and danger. She had received visits from various village residents who had wished to discuss the affair and to gain her perspective on what had occurred and what it might signify regarding village life and human nature more broadly. She had responded to these conversations with her characteristic combination of careful listening and gentle wisdom, offering observations that seemed merely to reflect obvious truths, yet which carried considerable depth of understanding and recognition of human complexity. She had noted, in various conversations with village residents, that the events of the summer had provided a kind of education regarding the nature of deception and the importance of maintaining vigilance and skepticism, even within communities that appeared to be fundamentally trustworthy and stable. By the time winter had fully established itself in St. Mary Mead, with snow covering the gardens and ice forming on the village lanes, the affair with Diana Hartwell had largely faded from immediate public preoccupation, though it had left its mark on the collective memory and consciousness of the village. Various residents had modified their behavior and their attitudes toward social relationships, becoming somewhat more cautious and somewhat more skeptical in their interactions with others, a transformation that reflected the lessons they had learned from the exposure of Diana's elaborate deceptions. The village had returned to its customary patterns and rhythms, though enriched or perhaps burdened by the recognition that evil and danger could manifest themselves in unexpectedly pleasant and attractive forms, and that the surface appearance of trustworthiness could conceal considerable darkness and calculated malevolence lurking beneath. It was on a particularly quiet afternoon in late December, as snow fell gently outside her cottage windows, and the village of St. Mary Mead seemed to exist in a state of suspended animation between the activities of autumn and the festivities of Christmas, that Miss Marple received a visitor of unexpected significance. The visitor was none other than Inspector David Hartbury, who had called upon her ostensibly to discuss certain administrative matters related to the Diana Hartwell case, and to express the official gratitude of the police force for her contributions to the investigation. However, as they sat together in Miss Marple's parlor, with tea steaming gently between them, the inspector had broached a subject that extended considerably beyond mere administrative courtesy or professional appreciation. He had remarked that he found himself in a somewhat unusual position, having spent considerable time during the investigation reflecting upon the methods by which Miss Marple had arrived at her conclusions, and the ways in which her approach to investigation differed fundamentally from the more conventional investigative techniques employed by police forces. He had observed that Miss Marple's methodology appeared to rely primarily on psychological insight, careful observation of human behavior, and a seemingly intuitive understanding of human motivation that allowed her to perceive truths that more direct investigative approaches might overlook. He had wondered aloud whether Miss Marple had ever considered that her particular skills and insights might be of considerable value in a more formal investigative capacity, and whether she might be willing to serve occasionally as a consultant to the police regarding matters that seemed to involve significant complexities of human psychology and motivation. Miss Marple had received this suggestion with evident appreciation, though she had generally declined the inspector's offer, suggesting that she had found her life in St. Mary Mead sufficiently engaging and satisfying that she had no desire to become more formally involved in official investigative procedures. She had explained that her particular approach to understanding human behavior seemed to function most effectively within the context of her village community, where she possessed extensive knowledge of residents and their histories, and where she could observe behavioral patterns across extended periods of time. She had suggested that her effectiveness as an observer and analyst derived largely from her position as an outsider to official processes, someone who could move through the village without the formal authority or the procedural constraints that characterized official investigation. She had further noted that she valued her independence and her ability to pursue inquiries according to her own understanding and according to her own moral compass, rather than according to the requirements and procedures of formal law enforcement. The inspector had accepted her refusal with evident disappointment tempered by understanding, and had acknowledged that her perspective regarding her own role and her own effectiveness probably contained considerable wisdom. Before departing, he had noted that he believed Miss Marple's analysis of the Diana Hartwell case represented perhaps the most sophisticated and penetrating investigation he had encountered in his professional career, and that he would remain impressed by her capacity to perceive patterns and meanings in human behavior that had eluded more conventional investigative approaches. He had left her cottage with a sense of mutual respect and professional regard that suggested the possibility of future consultation, should circumstances warrant it. After the inspector's departure, Miss Marple had settled once more into her familiar armchair, and had retrieved her knitting, a new project, a pale green shawl that she had begun in early December. As her needles had clicked their familiar rhythm, and her fingers had worked through the pattern with practiced precision, her mind had continued to occupy itself with reflections on the entire affair with Diana Hartwell, and the broader questions it had raised regarding human nature, morality, and the operation of justice within community contexts. She had recognized that Diana's story, while individual and particular in its specifics, exemplified certain larger patterns regarding the ways in which human beings responded to injustice, how they rationalized increasingly unethical conduct, and how legitimate grievances could transform into something considerably darker and more destructive if they were not addressed and resolved through constructive means. Yet Miss Marple had also recognized that her role in exposing Diana's crimes had not been primarily about the satisfaction of having solved a puzzle or having demonstrated her own cleverness and insight. Rather, she had recognized that her fundamental motivation had been rooted in her conviction that truth and justice were important, that deception and manipulation could not be permitted to continue unchecked within a community, and that individuals who had been harmed by deliberate criminal conduct deserved to have that harm acknowledged and addressed. She had perceived her investigation not as an exercise in intellectual virtuosity, but rather as a moral obligation that had emerged from her long years of living within the community and her accumulated understanding of the importance of maintaining the fundamental trust and honesty upon which functional communities depended. The Christmas season had proceeded with its customary activities and celebrations, and Miss Marple had participated in various village festivities with her customary grace and attention to community welfare. She had attended the church service on Christmas Eve, had participated in the Women's Institute's Christmas gathering, and had exchanged gifts and greetings with various village residents who had called upon her to offer seasonal wishes. She had hosted a small gathering at her cottage for several close friends and long-standing acquaintances, including Margaret Ashford, who had appeared considerably more settled and more at peace than she had seemed during the months immediately following Diana's arrest and trial. Margaret had expressed gratitude toward Miss Marple for her role in the affair, though she had also acknowledged that the entire experience had left her with considerable sadness regarding her son's vulnerability and regarding her own failure to perceive the threats that Diana represented. She had noted that Peter had begun to rebuild his life in a new town, and that while their relationship remained somewhat strained and somewhat cautious, she harbored hope that time and distance might allow for a genuine reconciliation and a rebuilding of the trust that had been damaged through the events of the summer. She had expressed hope that the village itself might gradually move beyond the events that had disrupted its peace, and that it might return to something approaching its former state of tranquility and ordinary social engagement. As Miss Marple had listened to Margaret's reflections, she had recognized that the affair with Diana Hartwell had indeed reached its resolution, though the resolution was not the kind of neat and satisfying conclusion that appeared in detective novels and mystery stories. Instead, it was a resolution characterized by complexity, by the recognition that the world contained considerable moral ambiguity, and that human beings rarely fit neatly into categories of simple virtue or obvious villainy. It was a resolution that acknowledged that justice, when it came through the difficult and sometimes painful processes of exposure and accountability, but that such justice did not erase the underlying causes of criminal conduct or eliminate the suffering that had preceded the crime. Yet as the Christmas season had given way to the new year, and as 1955 had arrived with its customary promise of fresh beginnings and new possibilities, Miss Marple had found herself at peace with the resolution that had been achieved. She had recognized that she had played her role as she understood it, that she had employed her particular gifts and insights in service of truth and justice, and that while the outcomes had been far from perfect, they had been as good as circumstances and human limitation would permit. She had settled into the quiet rhythms of early winter village life, her needlework progressing steadily, her correspondence with various correspondents continuing its familiar patterns, and her presence in the village remaining that of a quiet observer and occasional participant in the AFA.